before we go into the neuroscience of intelligence, I want to start with just again going back to the definition and different ways of thinking about intelligence, and with the question what we are even talking about. There's this quote by Sternberg that was also quoted in Marina's presentation. Viewed narrowly, there seem to be almost as many definitions of intelligence as there were experts asked to define it. So this hints kind of as this issue that we've been struggling with all day of finding a meaningful definition of intelligence that can really serve a lot of purposes at the same time. There can be this more abstract intelligence, but also the emotional part. And if we are looking at building artificial intelligences, we are really looking at a different task altogether that might divert in some ways of how we think of intelligence and testing it in humans. So I collected a couple of quotes from this paper by Shane Leck from DeepMind titled Universal Intelligence, a Definition of Machine Intelligence. There's a kind of tongue-in-cheek famous quote that Esbert also mentioned. Intelligence is what is measured by intelligence tests. Yeah, I also don't agree, but it's like one way of defining it. There's intelligence is a general factor that runs through all types of performance, which emphasizes the performance aspect, and the general factor that defined the name G factor. There's the capacity for knowledge and knowledge possessed, so more the storing of information and representing it in meaningful ways that actually help us navigate in our lives. And also a very important aspect, the capacity to learn or profit by experience. So I think this is sometimes an underemphasized aspect if you look at it from the question of representing knowledge, but it starts with the learning of knowledge and representing knowledge, and I will elaborate that further in the course of my presentation. Shane Leck came up with this somewhat dry and mathematical definition, but I promise it's actually the only formula I have in my presentation. But the definition he came up with is intelligence measures an agent's ability to achieve goals in a wide range of environments. So if we break that down into this formula, I'm just going to read it out. Let E be the space of computable, reward-summable environmental measures with respect to the reference machine U, and let K be the Kolmogorov complexity function, and the expected performance of an agent pi with respect to the universal distribution over the space of all environments is given by this formula. So I think now, after the lunch break, I've successfully put you all to sleep with this definition. But if we look at it into a bit more detail, it's actually pretty intuitive what's happening here. So you have the sum over the environments. So this expresses really the range of environments we want to act meaningfully in. And for human beings, we don't just navigate in space, we navigate in environments like a chessboard, a Go board. We navigate virtual spaces and physical ones, and complex social interactions, and so many things we are able to do. The complexity of the environment is here defined in a pretty mathematical term, but it hints at the question of how well can we operate if we are faced with complexity that we probably don't know too much about. And the last part is the value function, which is also very crucial, because intelligence doesn't mean anything if we can't extract value with it. So it's really always coupled to this value extraction part. And some of you that are a bit familiar with artificial intelligence might be reminded of reinforcement learning and this idea of defining value functions and kind of training on them by teaching the agent to extract value from environments. So this is one way of looking at it. One other, I think, thing that is important to mention in the beginning is that also hints to some difficulties we have in AI, is that it's hard for us to estimate what is actually hard in terms of intelligence and what is not so hard. So you have a self-driving car here, and you have the recent World Chess Championship match between Carlsen and Nepomniachtchi. And I think most of us look at chess as something really difficult, and that's why it's also kind of a paradigmatic thing that is associated with people being intelligent. But on the other hand, if you look at chess engines, 1997 saw Garry Kasparov being beaten by Deep Blue, and by now human beings are completely dominated by chess engines. It's not even close, not even remotely close, but we don't have self-driving cars that can actually generalize as well as 16-year-old children that had driving lessons for 15 hours or something. So our intuitions here are kind of flawed, and that connects to what is easy to build in terms of artificial intelligence, and some of the things we take for granted. Another kind of poignant example of this is MIT actually in 1966, which is quite a long while ago now, decided to go for a summer project called Solving Vision. So they wanted to solve vision as a summer project, and most of the tasks they set out to do in that summer project we still haven't solved. So they were completely off in their estimate of how difficult a problem it actually was, and how difficult visual processing is actually if we want to program it and implement it in machines. And Jitendra Malik, who is a famous vision scientist in the AI community, he connects it to the fact that visual processing is mostly subconscious. So we look around this room, we see shades, and we recognize people, and all of that happens automatically and instantly and subconsciously. So we just think, yeah, it's probably no big deal. It doesn't make us too intelligent to do that. While on the other hand, chess is something that we have to very laboriously learn to do, and that might actually be more easy to automate in machines. And as the last point before I get into the neuroscience of intelligence, I want to give this quote by Wittgenstein: "Philosophy is the battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language." And I think this hints at something a bit, very profound, that is not only related to intelligence, but sometimes we define certain terms and concepts like intelligence, and we think we know what we mean by it, and other people mean roughly the same thing. But if they mean different things, we all use the same term, the same word, intelligence, and we tend to completely talk past each other. So I think from that sense, it's really cool today to go at intelligence from a lot of different angles and actually try to clear up what people from AI, from neuroscience, from psychology mean by this word. What I won't have time to go into is we saw now in the first talk, especially, that human intelligence manifests in different ways for different people. Sorry, this is the slide what I'm actually going to focus on. So human intelligence is very different from animal intelligence, or at least it's what we think it is. And it's not very clear to us from an evolutionary standpoint how that shift actually happened in the last couple of 100,000 years. And at the last point, I want to explain how these insights from how the brain scaled up its intelligence can help us potentially build new AI applications. And in turn, how AI and neuroscience overlap with each other. And I won't have time to talk about the neuroscientific manifestations of intelligence differences. As we heard about in the first talk, this is actually really difficult because we know that a lot of genes interact in complicated ways. And this has to have an effect on the brain, because intelligence has to happen in the brain and be processed in it, but we don't have very clear neuroscientific underpinnings of what intelligence actually is. But again, this is a topic for a different talk. So now to the actual focus areas of my presentation. I want to go into the origins of intelligence, where it actually comes from, and how we can explain its rapid rise in mankind. Then I want to talk about how this factors into how we can trace intelligence in the brain and the cortex more specifically, and how it connects to ideas of a universal algorithm that might underlie all of our neural processing. And then I want to go briefly into how this connects to AI, also foreshadowing the last talk by Alejandro, where we go into that in much more detail. So now we have a second picture of apes slowly standing up, and this connects to what Marina also talked about already. And I want to approach it from this question of how we can explain this rapid rise in intelligence. So starting with a quote from Darwin, because in evolution you always have to start with Darwin. "As many more individuals of each species are born that can possibly survive, it follows that any being, if it vary however slightly in any manner profitable to itself, will have a better chance of surviving and thus be selected." So we all know this concept probably from the inside out, and it is usually summarized in some way as survival of the fittest. So if something changes and that allows us to survive better, then it gets selected for our species, and our species slowly over time improve their adaptability. But we have to contrast this with this explosion of human cognitive abilities in the last million of years. That is really, from an evolutionary perspective, considering how old the Earth is and how old eukaryote life on Earth is very recent. And connect that to the fact that most useful byproducts of intelligence are actually not that clearly linked to survival in a more ancient age. If we want to put that as a timeline, we split off from monkeys 5 million years ago. And the modern Stone Age and tool use, very rudimentary tool use with the hunter-gatherers started roughly 1 million years ago, when we had already split away from the apes for quite some time. But only 100,000 years ago, you have the dawn of the modern Homo sapiens that is roughly as intelligent as we are and has similar genetics that code for the brain. But only 10,000 years ago, we have agriculture and the beginnings of culture as we know it. And only 5,000 years ago, we have the Bronze Age and even the first traces of more complex use of technologies like writing and mathematics. And only 200 years ago, or you can take an arbitrarily short amount of time, it has become useful to be good at IQ tests. And with that, I mean the ability to perform these abstract manipulation of symbols and literacy and many of the things we think really are defining of the advances in human civilization through our intelligence and our mental faculties. So I want to connect that to some of the unique features of human intelligence as we know them that have evolved. There's really this abstract learning that has helped us so much to develop technologies and understand the world around us better. There's language and literacy that allows us to communicate with each other across space and time. So we also can communicate with people in the past. I can read papers that Einstein wrote where he's put on a lot of his wisdom. We can use that to build complex causal models of the world, which helps us really in physics, but in many other ways to act more meaningfully in the world. We have long-term episodic memory. We also have short-term memory and working memory, which is something that was also mentioned in the first talk, which allows us to really go back far into the past and learn from things that have happened ages ago and even from other people. And we have theory of mind that helps us to understand others. And last but not least, we actually develop self-knowledge that far surpasses that of animals, that helps us to understand ourselves and really through the model that we have of ourselves to also correct our errors. But now that we've established a couple of the unique features of human intelligence, it's still interesting to ask what intelligence is actually good for, because again, looking back in time, we had a very different lifestyle. So it was very different for us. We had a very different set of tasks that we needed to fulfill in daily life. And thus, many of the advantages of our scaling up of our cortex don't have a clear evolutionary advantage, or at least that's what some people claim. And I think that's a reasonable claim to make. Will von Hippel wrote this interesting book, The Social Leap, where he's talking about the similar fact that Marina also mentioned, that the brain is primarily evolved to keep really track of the complex social interactions, because there's little more unpredictable and complicated than hanging around in a tribe with 150 other people. And there's so much complicated factors that come in that are not really usually connected to surviving in the rainforest. And this change in social structure is actually connected to us leaving the rainforest and having to hunt together in the savannah, which necessitates cooperation between us. And Geoffrey West in The Mating Mind gives another very interesting hypothesis that intelligence is really more about sexual selection and not about survival of the fittest, but really more the question, what is selected as attractive? And that could imply that intelligence is not really something very useful, but it indicates in a more general sense something like fitness. If you think of deer that have these huge antlers on their head, these antlers don't really serve a big purpose, and they make life much harder for deer in everyday life because they have to carry useless weight around with them. But in another sense, it signals that this deer that has a very healthy antler is in some way a very healthy individual and worth mating with. And this can lead to very interesting effects that I don't have time to go into now. I can recommend these books. But this also begs the question of why didn't we see 100,000 years ago this very dramatic change in human society when the neural architecture was already in place? And this connects to hypotheses around cultural evolution by, for example, Joe Henrich, who's talking about that cultural evolution is really the key to our success in now building this very strange world that human beings have built up. And it being not based on evolution primarily, but on the fact that this evolution that happened in our brain can be ideas have a very unique way of propagating in these ways. So to sum that up with one question, if our intelligence evolved so randomly, might it be simpler than we think? Now I want to take this question to the neuroscience and to the architecture of the brain and explore this question a bit further. So we have a lot of synapses in our brain. This number is so large that I actually don't know what it's called. It's something's in the billion trillions. And this encapsulates the number of connections we have between different neurons in the brain. And this connectome is thought to be involved in basically storing our knowledge, doing the computation that is necessary to be intelligent, but contrasted with this much smaller number of genes in the human genome. So we only have 20,000 genes, which is a pretty small amount of information. And this has to code in some way for our brain and therefore for the intelligence in our brain. And contrasted to this 20,000 genes in the tomato genome, which is there's this incredible increase in complexity in the human behavior and in the human brain, which doesn't really reflect in a hugely blown up genome, for example. And this leads us to this hypothesis that intelligence might actually be a bit simpler than we think. And if we put that down into a storage size, the genome that codes for the brain is roughly 25 million bytes large. And this contains all of the design information for our brain. And I think most of you are familiar with what 25 megabytes are. That's like 5 pictures that you take with the camera. So it's a very small amount of information. So that obviously implies that the genome cannot really encode our knowledge of the world. It cannot encode our intelligence in a top-down manner. And this might be also a hint why old-fashioned symbolic AI that Alejandro will talk a bit about, I think, or introduce, actually failed, because it started from the knowledge and tried to encode all of the things we know. It tried to encode gravity and how language works and how every language works from a top-down way. And then you need huge libraries. You need the whole of Wikipedia, for example, but you can't encode all of our intelligence in that way. But what's really important is that the brain comes well equipped to learn and to process information and to scale up in a meaningful way. So this leads us to the question, are we missing some kind of narrative that could explain why there's something simpler going on? I want to quickly go into how the brain is built up, into this distinction between the old brain and the new brain. The old brain is the part of the brain that's connected to all of our old function that is conserved across people. There's this joke in neurobiology that it's connected to the 4 Fs, fight, flight, feeding, and reproduction. And it contains the limbic system with the amygdala, the thalamus, hippocampus, and all of these are concerned across species and are already present in the lizard brain, for example. So asking ourselves, what are these conserved structures versus what sets of the human brain in a meaningful way? And the brain area that is really different from most animals is the cortex, the neocortex. Even though all mammals have a cortex, the human one is a bit larger than for most of them, even though the differences are not as substantial as it might seem. And it's thought to be involved in all kinds of things that make us so intelligent, that I already put down on earlier slides, all the higher cognitive functions, the multisensory processing, and it's usually considered to be the organ of intelligence. So if we take this idea of intelligence being in the neocortex seriously, then we can zoom in a bit into the cortex and look at its architecture, of how it's actually built up. And I don't know how familiar most of you are with the neocortex, but it's actually, I think, a bit surprising to learn how it's built up. It's a pretty thin sheet of neurons, even though it makes up most of the brain, like 90% of our neurons. It's only a thin sheet of layer that wraps around the other parts of the brain and composed pretty uniformly of 6 layers. So you have this layering of neurons that is pretty uniform across the entire cortex. And if you zoom in further, you have some substructure, and the substructure is still argued about in neuroscience, how to properly define it, but there are these cortical columns, which you can identify as these structures of densely interconnected neurons. And they follow this cortical sheet structure. I don't know if you can see that, but there's basically these 6 layers here, and these compose the cortical columns. And if you look closer at a cortical column, you can see these individual columns, which are kind of self-contained processing units, and they are composed of something around 100,000 neurons each. And they have subcolumns, which are again hierarchically built up of 100 neurons each roughly. And one of the ideas is now that these constitute somewhat independent processing units that can be stacked and repeated around the entire cortex, which would, already thinking of the evolutionary story, lead to a more simple universal algorithm across the cortex. There's a lot of evidence for that, but also some of the evidence is still a bit shaky. There is the idea that the scaling up could be achieved genetically very efficiently, because if you code for one cortical column, you can just repeat that a lot, and then you have 200,000 if they are built up in the same way. Then you only need to code for one, and this is a very efficient way of compressing the information about them. There's also this interesting fact in the cortex of neural plasticity. There's very interesting stories of plasticity happening. For example, if a blind person is born, much of the visual cortex is recycled for auditory processing, and then blind people actually start to see sound around them and take a lot of the resources from the visual cortex for this processing. And this happens with other lesions as well, where you can overtake a lot of different tasks with other brain areas. And if you think of the genome coding for a specific area for visual processing and one for auditory processing, where the information of how vision works is already encoded, that wouldn't work. So you make the assumption that then that means there's something more universal going on. And the shift in human intelligence would then more be connected to this scaling up of us just having more of these cortical columns than most animals, and this scaling up leading to a substantial or qualitative difference in our intelligence. So leading to this insight that more might be different. I want to connect this to some hypotheses for what this universal algorithm could actually be, and connected to a quote by Haugeland. The guiding inspiration for cognitive science is that a suitable level of abstraction, a theory of natural intelligence, should have the same basic form as the theories that explain sophisticated computer systems. So I don't know if you would agree with that statement. I think it makes the presupposition that the brain is indeed best understood as a computer. I don't know, maybe we can discuss this in the panel discussion later, if this is actually legitimate. But our best or most sophisticated theories of how computation works in the brain are based on computation and neuroscience, computational neuroscience. I quickly wanted to introduce this field. I don't know how familiar this is to most of you, but it really approaches the nervous system and neurons from the point of view of computation. So how can we understand the way the brain works from the brain computers work and computers do their processing? And the field is currently growing pretty fast, because our mathematical understanding of processing and information processing is increasing with neural networks and new techniques in AI. But we also have much more data available by now, because imaging methods in the brain have dramatically increased their power. So now, approaching this universal algorithm question from the perspective of neuroscience and computational neuroscience, there are two ideas, and again, I don't have time to go into most of this in too much detail. You can gladly check out the books these authors wrote, and I will also give a book list in the end if you're interested in following many of these topics in more detail. There's Jeff Hawkins, who founded the research institute Numenta, who wrote a book about the 1,000 brain hypothesis. And his basic idea is that the world is mapped out in something like reference frames, and each cortical constitutes one of these reference frames, and I will explain a bit more what this means and how to think about this. And there's Ray Kurzweil in How to Create a Mind, and to his view, the world is composed of a lot of patterns, and these patterns can be in language, they can be in vision, they can be in sound, and our brains are really very good at recognizing these patterns and connecting between them. And if you just stack a lot of these pattern recognizers, you already get a somewhat intelligent system out. And this might sound familiar to a lot of theories in machine learning nowadays. So to go a bit further in the thousand brain hypothesis. So again, as Jeff Hawkins thinks of these cortical columns as frames of references. And this might be a bit more counterintuitive than the pattern recognition, but I'll try to explain it a little bit. Many properties of our abstract thinking are actually rooted in spatial thinking, in the way we navigate this space here. For example, we can walk around, we know in which location we are. And if you take that to an abstract space, we also, if we look at dogs, we can, for example, scale them across abstract dimension. We have a dog that is small and one that is large, and then we have in between spaces, and we can kind of understand the shadings of difference between them in spatial terms. And this would also give a coherent kind of evolutionary story of how the brain managed to recycle certain structures it already had, because we are very good at navigating, because we already lived in a three-dimensional world and needed to find our way home. And there's interesting work done by the Dörler Lab in Leipzig, for example, in Constantinescu, if you're interested in these abstract representations of knowledge in these abstract spaces. And then you need to connect these reference frames with a voting mechanism and with a way of building a model of the world through moving in the world and through creating all of these frames of references that allows us to kind of reflect on the world. And I think most of us can relate to that in some way, because we can close our eyes and, for example, think of a microphone and turn it in our heads. So we have kind of a spatial referential representation of that in our mind. And this was inspired by grid cells, which won the Nobel Prize in 2014, because our brain really represents location through the firing of neurons. And if we find these kind of structures in the cortical columns, then we know that some kind of spatial information is represented there. So the idea is, if you have a rat that is walking through a maze, if you think of this as a two-dimensional maze, then in some locations, certain neurons are firing, and in some of them they are not. And what is very surprising, and what led to this Nobel Prize, is that depending on which location the rat is in the maze, the same neuron fires, and the same neuron isn't really only tied to that place in the maze, but it's not to that specific place, but it really creates this map-like structure that encodes this information that can be very nicely correlated to the firing of the neuron. So again, this was a very influential insight in neuroscience, which inspired some of the ideas now of how the cortex might also make use of similar grid cell-like structures. And in that sense, each cortical column kind of independently represents a reference frame, be it of visual nature, of auditory nature. And each part of the neocortex actually learns complete models of objects in the world, but also of more abstract concepts. And then the reference frames interact in some meaningful way to vote for the cognitive input and what they actually think the cortical column represents. We will talk about predictive models of the world in much more detail in Alejandro's talk, so that we'll elaborate a bit further on how you can understand this model building. And yeah, this is basically a very short summary of the thousand brain hypothesis, and it's called a thousand brain hypothesis because then the cortical columns form these mini brain structures that work independently and create a model of the world independently. And the second hypothesis of what the cortical columns could actually be doing is through pattern recognizers. So breaking down this sentence on the last slide spoke about the thousand brains hypothesis. This is composed of a lot of patterns. And as I assume most of you know how to read the sentence, you have a lot of pattern recognition implicitly happening in your brain. So you can see these individual letters, but you can put them together into words that then also mean something to you. And these letters form phrases, and from these phrases then slowly emerge on higher levels something like meaning and some meaningful patterns about that help you understand this sentence as a construct. And again, building that up hierarchically, you have several layers of hierarchy of where these patterns are recognized, starting from the simplest, most basic layers. And then if you assume that the world is actually arranged in such a way, then we can think of these subcolumns of 100 neurons, for example, really coding for very specific individual patterns, be it certain shapes in vision, like diagonal lines that I will show on the next slide, or certain words or letters. And because we have so many of them and we have much more than animals, we can learn many more patterns about the world. And if we have many more patterns about the world that encode the world, we can integrate them in more interesting ways. And this is, again, as I already mentioned, pretty similar to what neural networks are doing and what they've become famous in doing in the last couple of years. And they also connect to this very influential work by Jubel and Wiese that got the Nobel Prize in 1981, where they explicitly looked at the visual cortex and how visual processing works. And they found this kind of sheet-wise structure of layers in the visual cortex. And they could also connect that to an increasing complexity of patterns. So if you look at that, you start with a visual input like an elephant, a penguin, and every picture that we see is composed of some kind of lines and horizontal lines and lines of different angles. And in the visual cortex, you can actually observe that if you show a person a line that is pointed, for example, at this angle, then a specific set of neurons will fire and they won't fire anytime else. And if you put that up to more layers of complexity, you start to recognize the head of the elephant, the trunk of the elephant. And in the final layer, you have a complex abstract concept like an elephant that is recognized. But this is built up of things that can be recycled. And again, this is something that is famously already successfully done in machine learning. We can just teach computers to recognize elephants and cats and dogs and distinguish them, and actually now to better level of precision than human beings. So if we believe that story, then that would mean our machines are already pretty close to following the architecture of how human beings like our intelligence. So we are already pretty close to something like intelligent machines. But again, there is, I think, to my mind, I wanted to propose this or like talk about this theory, but I think there's a lot of ingredients still missing that are really the most important ingredients to what integrates intelligence in human beings. But to give a quick summary of this idea of this universal algorithm, the backbone of human intelligence might rely on more unspecific principles that we can repeat across the cortex pretty uniformly, and then we can just scale it up. In evolutionary terms, we can scale it up and also use it for other things like social interactions. And it doesn't have to bring us a huge survival advantage in order to be selected. And the evidence for that is that the cortex actually looks relatively homogeneous, even though we don't have like a clear connection between which genes code for the cortical columns, for example. But as we already heard, doing these connecting genetics to architecture is an incredibly difficult challenge. One idea of what they could actually do is these frames of reference inspired by grid cells and place cells that encode spatial information in the brain. And another one is these pattern recognizers that we already are quite familiar with, and I think know from the visual cortex that at least to an extent the brain works on this principle. So what does it actually mean for AI? I won't go into that in too much detail because Alejandro will focus his entire talk on the topic of AI and robotics, where we take it from here. But I wanted to quickly summarize the state of machine intelligence and where some inspiration from neuroscience may come in. So Descartes already lived 400 years ago, but he still thought about machine intelligence. I think he was kind of born in the wrong age in that regard because he was so far away from the technological possibilities. But it's pretty crazy that now we actually are at the point where we can implement most of these functions in some way in computers. So even though machines might do something as well as we do them, or perhaps even better, they would inevitably fail in others, which would reveal they were acting not through understanding, but only from the disposition of their organs. So to put that connect that to kind of the state of machine intelligence and current AI, there's this very interesting article by François Chollet also from Google on the measure of intelligence, where he's talking about where are we actually right now with AI algorithms and how, in what sense are they intelligent and what is still missing. So we have this narrow intelligence, narrow AI, that is a bit different from this much more general human intelligence, because it doesn't have as much flexible learning. But in the narrow tasks that we look at, like playing chess, like recognizing images, the machine learning algorithms are actually very strong and usually outperform human beings as soon as we manage to get close to their performance. But they still have mostly dense training sets and a lot of data, and they are very bad at dealing with unknown unknowns. So they don't really know how to deal with certainty. They are being taught, like they learn what they are being taught, and they don't explore on their own, for example. And they don't really understand or generalize. And I think we could host a different conference about the term understanding and what it actually means in terms of how that connects to intelligence. But it's still kind of interesting that there still seems to be this substantial difference, even though we have a lot of narrow AIs that are good at what we do. Just to connect that to the figure I showed previously, we already have in most of these areas at least attempts to get close to the performance of human beings. There's an abstract learning there. We have symbolic solvers. There's also AIs like the Feynman AI, where you just give it data measurements from masses moving around and can actually infer the Newtonian laws just from this data. We can reconstruct dynamical systems. You have GPT-3, which are incredibly powerful language models, where you can generate meaningful paragraphs of text where people wouldn't recognize that it's not written by a human being. We have long-term episodic memory, which human beings are actually not that good at. We have USB sticks and hard drives that are much better at remembering things than we are. Machines might not have theory of mind, but we have facial recognition and sentiment analysis. Maybe there's also an interesting discussion point for later, how like machine learning algorithms that look at these faces could also perform well in EI tasks, potentially. And we try to build self-knowledge into our models by making them statistical and really incorporating uncertainty and errors, which Alejandro will talk about. From that point of view, it's a bit hard to estimate how far we actually are from achieving artificial general intelligence. There are these many surveys among AI experts how far away we actually are, and they range from sometimes before 3000 to the next 5 years or 10 years. So it's really a lot of uncertainty in the field, but the median answer pretty homogeneously is around 20 years, which is definitely not far away into the future. And I think the answer to that question really depends on what intelligence actually is and how misunderstood we have it from that kind of perspective. And to sum that up, and can AI actually learn from the brain? We have these large models with impressive performance, but most AI algorithms are probably pretty distinct from the principle of the brain, and there's something we haven't understood. Jan LeCun from Facebook calls this like the dark matter of intelligence. And there's still a lot of room for inspiration from neuroscience, depending on who is right. If the pattern recognition perspective is correct, then we are actually pretty close. But if the frames of reference perspectives is correct, then we are very far from building our algorithms in a similar way to what the brain is doing. There's embodied action-based approaches in robotics. There's Carl Frissen's free energy that we will learn about now. And really depending on the simplicity of how simple intelligence actually is, we could be relatively close, we could be relatively far away. But it's definitely, given that the brain is the organ that is responsible for intelligence, it's a very interesting place and fruitful place to look. And I want to finish with this last quote. Machine intelligence is the last invention that humanity will ever need to make. Thank you.